Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The silent struggle. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the neat suburban neighborhood. Officer Luke Hayes sat at the wheel of his patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he slowly drove down the streets he knew like the back of his hand. The smell of freshly cut grass and the faint scent of dinner being prepared in nearby homes filled the air, but Luke's mind was elsewhere. It had been years since he felt truly connected to his surroundings. His life had become a blur of endless shifts and unremarkable encounters, each day bleeding into the next. As a seasoned police officer, Luke had grown accustomed to the routine of his job. He knew every street, every house, every corner of his district. He had dealt with more than his fair share of domestic disputes, robberies, and accidents, but none of them seemed to shake him anymore. The job had become just that, a job. A task he performed mechanically, without emotion, without attachment. But today, something was different. As he passed by the local playground, his eyes caught sight of a little girl sitting on the swings. The playground, usually filled with the sounds of laughter and playful shouts, was eerily quiet. The girl was alone, her small body moving back and forth in a rhythm that seemed out of place in the empty park. Her dark hair caught the last rays of the setting sun, casting a golden halo around her face. Luke's gaze lingered on her for a moment, but he quickly shook his head and muttered to himself, "Just another quiet afternoon." He continued on his patrol, but something gnawed at him, pulling his thoughts back to the playground. He pushed it aside, telling himself he was just imagining things. After all, children played in the park all the time. It was nothing unusual. But as he drove around the block, something caught his eye. He slowed the car and looked back at the playground. The girl was no longer on the swing. Instead, she was lying on the ground, curled up under the slide, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Luke's heart skipped a beat. He pulled over, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stepped out of the car. There was something unsettling about the way she was lying there. She looked so small, so vulnerable in the growing dusk. "Hey there," Luke called out softly, his voice almost gentler than he intended as he approached the little girl. He knelt down beside her, gently shaking her shoulder. "Wake up, sweetheart." The girl's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she just stared up at him, confusion and fear flashing across her face. Her dark eyes were wide, reflecting the fading light of the street lamps. "It's okay," Luke reassured her, offering a small smile that felt more like a habit than a genuine gesture of comfort. "I'm Officer Luke. What are you doing out here by yourself?" She blinked, still disoriented, as she slowly sat up. Her tiny frame seemed even smaller as she hugged herself tightly, shivering from the cool evening air. "I'm waiting for my mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though speaking louder would make her situation more real. "Where is she?" Luke asked, his brow furrowing. Something wasn't adding up. It wasn't normal for a young child to be out here alone, let alone sleeping in the park. The girl's lip trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "She left to find work. She said she'd come back," she choked out, her voice cracking with fear. Luke felt a pang in his chest. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his usual calm, professional demeanor. "How long has she been gone?" he asked gently. The girl paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. 5 days, she whispered, her voice barely a sound. 5 days. The words hit Luke like a punch in the stomach. He stared at the little girl, trying to process the weight of what she had just said. She had been alone, sleeping in the playground for 5 nights. "Where's your home, sweetheart?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though he already knew the answer. The girl looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. "We don't have one anymore," she said, her voice so small it was almost lost in the evening air. "Mom said the playground was safe. She promised she'd come back." Luke's heart sank. He fought to keep his emotions in check, but the ache in his chest grew stronger with each passing second. This little girl had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in a world that wasn't kind to those who had no one to protect them. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but they all led back to the same gut-wrenching truth: this child had nowhere to go. He knelt down to her level, his face softening. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Leah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Leah," Luke repeated, his voice steady, trying to offer her some semblance of comfort. "It's not safe for you to stay here alone. We need to find you somewhere warm to sleep tonight, okay?" Leah nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't go away. "Do you think my mom will find me if I leave?" she asked, her voice filled with hope and desperation. Luke hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I'm sure your mom wants you safe," he said, though he couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her. "But right now, it's not safe for you to stay here. I promise you, we'll look for your mom, but first we need to get you somewhere warm." Leah looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, and Luke felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. He had always kept his emotions locked away, never letting them show, but this little girl had somehow pierced through the walls he had built around himself. With gentle encouragement, Luke coaxed Leah into his patrol car, and as they drove to the station, he kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She was so small, so fragile, and yet there was something in her eyes, a quiet strength that Luke couldn't quite explain. He knew that her story was just beginning, and he was determined to make sure it didn't end in the shadows of a cold playground. He glanced at her again. She was looking out the window, her face a mixture of uncertainty and hope, and for the first time in years, Luke felt something stir inside him. Maybe it was time to start caring again. A glimmer of hope. The hum of the patrol car's engine was the only sound as Officer Luke Hayes drove through the quiet streets, the lights of the police station slowly coming into view. In the back seat, Leah sat wrapped in a thin, threadbare blanket, her small body hunched in on itself as though the weight of the world was bearing down on her fragile frame. Despite the warmth of the car, she looked cold, her small hands clutching the fabric of the blanket like it was her only tether to the world she once knew. Luke couldn't help but glance at her in the rearview mirror, his heart heavy with questions. What kind of mother leaves her child alone for days? Where had she gone? What had happened to Leah's mother? The officer's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized there were no answers, not yet. The station loomed ahead, the bright lights of the parking lot casting a cold glow over the scene. As Luke parked the patrol car, his hand rested briefly on the steering wheel. He let out a deep breath, trying to clear his thoughts, but nothing seemed to erase the image of Leah's small, broken figure lying under that slide in the playground. "Leah, we're here," he said gently, his voice softening. He knew she must have felt scared, alone, but he was trying to offer her as much comfort as he could without overstepping. She looked up at him, her wide eyes reflecting uncertainty. Luke stepped out of the car, moving around to the passenger side, where he opened the door and helped Leah out. Her tiny hand clutched his for a brief moment as she stepped onto the pavement, her bare feet barely making a sound as they walked together toward the station's entrance. Inside, the familiar sights and sounds of the police station were at odds with the deep sense of unease Luke felt. Officers moved around in a flurry of activity, answering phones, sorting paperwork, and dealing with the chaos that came with a busy night shift. But all of that faded into the background as Luke led Leah to a small waiting area. He had already taken care of the basic details. Leah would be given a warm place to stay for the night, and he'd made the necessary calls to social services. But despite the assurances of the system, Luke knew this wasn't just another case. This little girl had touched something deep inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. There was no going back now. "Wait here for a second, okay?" Luke said as he led Leah to a chair. She nodded slowly, still unsure of what was happening around her. Luke's heart twisted as he noticed how small she seemed, sitting there all alone, her legs dangling from the chair, her feet not quite reaching the ground. Luke went to his desk, where he rifled through the drawer for a blanket he kept for emergencies. As he pulled it out, he found himself thinking about Leah's story again, the loneliness in her eyes, the hollow ache in her voice when she spoke of her mother. She didn't deserve this. No child did. And if there was any way he could help her, he was determined to find it. He wrapped the thick woolen blanket around her shoulders, and for a brief moment, Leah looked up at him with a look of gratitude that almost broke him. "Thank you, Officer Luke," she said in a soft voice. "Thank you for helping me." Luke's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to say that. "You're welcome, Leah," he replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that he would find her mother and fix everything, but he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, Luke turned to the phone on his desk and began to make calls to social services. As he dialed the number, his mind raced with questions. Where could Leah's mother be? Had she truly left to find work, or had something happened to her? The possibilities seemed endless, and Luke was determined to explore every lead, no matter how small. While Luke worked the phones, Leah sat quietly in the chair, her wide eyes darting around the station. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived, and Luke didn't want to push her to share anything she wasn't ready to. She had already endured so much in such a short time, he wouldn't rush her to trust him. But as he glanced back at her, he could see the faint glimmer of hope beginning to return to her face. Luke didn't know what had drawn him to this case. Maybe it was the way Leah's courage shone through despite the hardships she had endured. Maybe it was the raw vulnerability she showed, how she clung to the idea of her mother returning. Whatever it was, it had shaken something inside him, and now, he couldn't turn away. "Leah," Luke said after finishing his call, standing up and walking toward her. "I'm going to make sure you're safe tonight. I'm going to get you the help you need." She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and for the first time since they had met, Luke saw a flicker of peace in her gaze. "Do you think Mom will come back?" she asked softly. Luke hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I'm sure your mom wants to come back to you," he said. Gently. "But right now, we need to focus on making sure you're safe. We'll find her, Leah. I promise you." Leah nodded, but her face was still clouded with uncertainty. She didn't seem convinced, and Luke didn't blame her. Her world had been turned upside down, and trust wasn't something easily given in her situation. After a few more minutes, Luke stood up, walking over to the other side of the room. He made another call, this time to a local shelter that could take Leah in for the night. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was the best they could do for now. The shelter had been vetted and had experience dealing with children in crisis. By the time he hung up the phone, Leah had finished the hot chocolate he had brought her earlier. The warmth from the drink seemed to have settled her, and she was no longer trembling. Luke had hoped that this small act of kindness might make her feel a little more at ease, but as she sat there, her gaze distant, it was clear she was still far from feeling safe. Leah's story haunted him as he thought about the many children in his district who went unnoticed. But Leah wasn't just another statistic. She was a young girl who had been abandoned by the very person who was supposed to protect her, and now, Luke had a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. But as Leah looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, he realized something: he didn't have to be ready. He had to be there for her, no matter what it took. As the minutes ticked by, Officer Luke Hayes made a silent vow to himself. He would find Leah's mother. He would bring her home. And in doing so, he would do everything he could to heal the broken pieces of Leah's heart. The road ahead was uncertain, but as long as Leah needed him, he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Searching for answers. The station was quieter now, the hum of activity fading as the shift began to wind down. Officer Luke Hayes sat at his desk, his hands hovering over the keyboard of his computer. But his mind was elsewhere, far from the reports that filled his inbox. It was on Leah, the little girl whose face had haunted him since he first found her alone in the playground. She was just a child, lost and vulnerable, her only hope resting in the promise of a mother who may never return. Luke glanced across the room to where Leah sat. She had made herself comfortable in the waiting area, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The hot chocolate he'd brought her had long since been finished, and now she sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her small face resting against the arm of the chair. She was exhausted, her eyelids heavy from days of sleeplessness, but still, she remained wide-eyed, unsure of what the future held. Luke had been on the force long enough to know that cases like this weren't solved overnight. But as he sat there, staring at Leah's tiny, fragile form, he felt a deep sense of urgency. He couldn't let her slip through the cracks. Not after everything she had been through. "Leah," Luke called softly, walking over to her. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice low as he knelt beside her. Leah gave a small nod, but didn't speak. Luke knew better than to force conversation, but he also knew how important it was to build a relationship with the little girl. He couldn't expect her to trust him right away. Trust was something that had been broken long before he'd come into the picture. He sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance, and let the silence stretch between them. "I'm going to find your mom," he said after a long pause, his words more to reassure himself than her. Leah's eyes flickered with a spark of hope, but then they dimmed again. "Do you think she'll come back for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke hesitated. It wasn't a question he could easily answer. He didn't want to give her false hope, but at the same time, he couldn't stand to see that hope fade from her eyes. "I don't know, Leah," he replied, his voice steady but soft. "But I promise you this, I'm going to do everything I can to find her and bring her back. I won't stop until I do." Leah didn't say anything for a long time, but Luke could see the faintest trace of trust begin to form in her expression. He wasn't sure if it was enough to hold on to, but it was something. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, and Luke's mind continued to race with thoughts of where to begin. He had already contacted social services, and they'd promised to send someone by the next day. But Luke knew the wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly. He couldn't just wait around for someone else to take action. Leah needed answers, and he was going to give them to her. He stood up and made a mental list of the next steps he needed to take. There were too many unknowns, too many questions left unanswered. He needed to start from the beginning. He turned to Leah. "Listen, I'm going to make some more calls. I need you to rest for a bit, okay? We'll find you a safe place to stay tonight." Leah nodded slowly, the exhaustion finally taking its toll. She didn't resist as Luke guided her back to the chair, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she closed her eyes, her small body curling up under the blanket. Luke turned back to his desk, his fingers moving across the keys of the computer with practiced efficiency. He opened the database for missing persons in the area and began to scroll through the entries. His eyes scanned each name, each face, but none of them seemed to match the woman Leah had described. He pulled up the local shelters and began calling, one after another. Each response brought a glimmer of hope, but they all led to dead ends. No one had seen Leah's mother, no one had heard from her. It was like she had vanished from the face of the earth. Luke's frustration began to mount, but he pushed it down. This was part of the job. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always clear-cut. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to give up. As the hours passed, the air in the station grew thick with the weight of the case. Luke's calls became less frequent as the night wore on, but his determination didn't waver. Leah needed him. And whether he was solving a case or facing an impossible situation, he was never one to walk away from a challenge. Around midnight, Luke finally sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He hadn't found any new leads, but he wasn't done yet. There were still places to check, people to speak with. He wouldn't rest until he had answers. Leah stirred in the chair beside him, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him with the same uncertain expression that had settled on her face earlier. "Did you find her?" she asked, her voice full of hope. Luke's heart sank as he realized the weight of her expectations. He wasn't sure how to answer her. He didn't want to break her heart, but he couldn't lie to her either. "Not yet," he said gently. "But I will. I won't stop looking, Leah." Leah nodded quietly, her eyes drifting back to the floor. Luke watched her for a moment, his mind racing with thoughts of how to move forward. He still had so many questions. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let Leah slip through the cracks. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Luke was back on the phone, calling local shelters, trying to get a lead on Leah's mother. His mind constantly returned to the promise he had made to the young girl. He knew he had to keep his word, no matter what. But as the hours wore on, and the calls led to more dead ends, Luke's optimism began to wear thin. Leah's mother hadn't been to any of the shelters, and no one had reported seeing her in the area. The trail was growing cold. It was then that Luke's phone rang. It wasn't a number he recognized, but something about it made him answer it immediately. "Officer Luke Hayes," he said, his voice tense with anticipation. "Luke, it's Officer Richards over at the Missing Persons Unit," the voice on the other end said. "We may have something." Luke's heart skipped a beat. "Go ahead." "We found a lead," Officer Richards continued. "A woman matching the description you gave us was spotted last night at a bus station on the outskirts of town. She seemed disoriented and was asking for money. We think she might be Leah's mother." Luke's pulse quickened. This was the break he had been waiting for. He didn't waste a second. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said, hanging up the phone. He rushed to grab his jacket and keys, his heart pounding with hope. This might be the moment they had been waiting for. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that the impossible might be within reach. The search was far from over. But for the first time, the glimmer of hope he had seen in Leah's eyes was beginning to match his own. The reunion. The patrol car roared down the empty streets, Luke's grip tight on the steering wheel as he sped towards the outskirts of town. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing with a mixture of urgency and hope. The lead he'd just received had reignited the spark of possibility he'd been clinging to ever since he first met Leah. Could this really be the moment he was about to find the answers they both desperately needed? The bus station was nestled between a small convenience store and a faded diner, bathed in the soft glow of a street lamp. Luke pulled up to the curb, his headlights cutting through the early morning fog, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He stepped out of the car, feeling the crisp air against his skin as he adjusted his jacket. For the first time in days, he could feel a glimmer of excitement stir within him. Could this be the end of Leah's nightmare? He walked quickly toward the entrance of the station, his mind racing. As he pushed open the door, the faint hum of an overhead fan greeted him. A few tired travelers sat in the corner, sipping from paper cups or flipping through magazines. The attendant behind the counter barely looked up when Luke approached, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "I'm looking for a woman who may have been here last night," Luke said, his voice firm but cautious. "She's in her 30s, about 5'6", brown hair. She might have been asking for money or help." The attendant paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he thought back. Then, after a long breath, he nodded. "Yeah, I remember her. She seemed off, disoriented. Came in around midnight, just kept talking about needing to get back to her daughter. She said she'd been looking for work for days." Luke's heart jumped into his throat. Her daughter. Was this finally the moment he could reunite Leah with her mother? He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew he couldn't leave until he had answers. "Can you tell me where she went after that?" Luke asked, leaning in a bit closer, his tone urgent. The attendant scratched his chin. "She left around 2 in the morning. Said she was headed to the shelter a few blocks away, but I'm not sure if she ever made it." Luke's pulse quickened as he mentally mapped out the area. He had a hunch. The shelter wasn't far, but it was also known to be a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, often with no intention of staying. Could it be that Leah's mom had been there, but simply left again in search of something, or someone else? Without another word, Luke turned and hurried out of the station. He had no time to waste, no room for hesitation. He started the patrol car and drove straight to the shelter. Every mile felt longer than the last, every minute dragged by with the weight of the possibility that Leah's mother could be slipping further away. As he pulled into the lot outside the shelter, Luke's eyes scanned the surroundings. It was a quiet, simple building, with an aging sign that read Community Safe Haven swinging gently in the breeze. The shelter was just waking up to the new day, its inhabitants slowly emerging from the building to face another uncertain morning. Luke approached the front door, his footsteps quick and purposeful. The shelter's director, a woman named Ruth, was just finishing her morning coffee when Luke stepped inside. She looked up with a start when she saw the officer. "Officer Hayes," she said with a warm but weary smile. "What brings you here this early?" "I'm looking for a woman who might have come through here last night. Her name is Nicole, Leah's mother." "Have you seen her?" Luke asked, his tone a mix of hope and determination. Ruth's face faltered for a moment, her expression becoming guarded. "I've seen a lot of people come and go," she said slowly. "But there was someone last night. She wasn't in good shape, kept saying she was looking for her daughter. I didn't catch her name, though." Luke felt his heart race. "Is she still here?" he asked, his eyes searching Ruth's face. Ruth shook her head. "She left early this morning. Didn't even stay for breakfast. But before she left, she said something about going to the park. The one on the west side of town." Luke didn't waste another second. He thanked Ruth quickly and rushed back to his patrol car, his heart thundering in his chest. The park. The same place where Leah had been waiting for her mother for days. It felt almost too perfect, too serendipitous, to be true. But Luke wasn't one to believe in coincidences. If Nicole had been looking for Leah, she would be there, at the same park where Leah had slept on the cold benches and under the slides. The drive to the park felt like it took forever. Luke's mind raced with every possible scenario. What if she wasn't there? What if he was too late? But something inside him told him that this was the moment. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the culmination of everything he had fought for in the last few days. When he pulled up to the park, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft glow over the playground. The swing swayed gently in the breeze, the slides shining in the first light of day. Luke's eyes scanned the area, his instincts telling him that he was close. He parked the car and stepped out, looking around for any sign of Nicole or Leah. The park was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made everything feel more significant. And then, he saw her. At the far end of the park, sitting on a bench, was a woman with brown hair, disheveled and worn, but unmistakably Leah's mother. Nicole looked up as Luke approached, her eyes tired but full of desperation. "Are you?" Luke began, his voice faltering for just a moment. Nicole's eyes widened as she recognized the officer. "Have you found my daughter?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Luke's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the reunion they had both been waiting for. He nodded slowly, his voice gentle as he spoke. "Yes, I've found her. She's safe. She's waiting for you." Nicole's face crumpled with emotion as tears filled her eyes. She stood up shakily, her hands reaching out toward Luke as if to confirm that this was real. The last few days had taken their toll on her, but the thought of being reunited with her daughter was enough to make her take that first step forward. Luke gestured for her to follow him, and together, they walked back to the patrol car. Nicole's steps quickened as they neared the vehicle, her eyes darting back and forth in search of her child. When they reached the door, Leah was standing there, her small face lit up with a mixture of confusion and hope. And then, in a moment that seemed to last forever, Leah's eyes met her mother's. The two of them stood frozen for a heartbeat, as if not daring to believe that this was real. And then, as if the weight of everything that had happened over the past days finally lifted, they collapsed into each other's arms. Nicole held Leah tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered apologies and words of love into her daughter's ear. Leah, too, clung to her mother, her small body shaking with emotion. In that moment, everything else faded away, the loneliness, the fear, the cold. All that mattered was the bond they shared, a bond that could never be broken. Luke stood back, watching the reunion with quiet satisfaction. He had kept his promise. He had done everything he could to bring them back together. And as he watched mother and daughter embrace, he knew that, in some small way, this was why he had chosen this job. Not for the badge or the authority, but for moments like this, the chance to make a real difference in someone's life. As he turned to leave, his eyes met Leah's once more. She looked up at him with a smile that was nothing short of radiant, the kind of smile that spoke of hope and healing. And in that moment, Luke knew that both their lives had changed forever.